In this lesson, we will be looking at the period immediately following the French and Indian War, which we have titled Conflict in the Colonies. Conflict in the Colonies. The big idea: tensions developed as the British government placed tax after tax on the colonies. Main ideas: British efforts to raise taxes on colonists sparked protest. The Boston Massacre caused colonial resentment towards Great Britain. Colonists protested the British tax on tea with the Boston Tea Party. Great Britain responded to colonial actions by passing the Intolerable Acts. Main idea 1: British efforts to raise taxes on the colonists sparked protest. Great Britain had to pay for the French and Indian War and for keeping around 10,000 troops stationed permanently in North America, not only to protect the colonists, but also to keep the colonists away from Native Americans who were west of the Appalachian Mountains. These troops were kept there basically to try to prevent the outbreak of another war. But keeping a large army standing in peacetime costs a lot of money. And the way that governments raise money is through taxation. Parliament passed the Sugar Act in 1764 to tax colonists to make them help pay for the costs of maintaining a large standing army in North America and to help pay for the cost of the war. Parliament's actions upset many colonists, not the least reason being that a lot of these colonists felt like, well, we were the ones who won the war, why should we have to pay for it? They didn't feel that there was a reason for them to be taxed. Colonists believed that there should be no taxes without representation in Parliament, but under the mercantilist system, the colonists were treated effectively as though, if we were to relate it to something we could all understand, colonists in the British colonies in North America were basically like tenants in an apartment building. They don't actually own the apartment building, therefore the owner of the apartment building doesn't really have to listen to anything that they have to say. You can complain if you want, but you don't have a say in the way business is conducted. And for colonists in the Americas, that's basically how they were treated. They were expected to be obedient tenants and not to cause trouble, and therefore they didn't have a right to representation in Parliament. Samuel Adams, a colonial leader, set up the Committees of Correspondence to protest this Sugar Act, the front piece of which we have here. This act from George III, an act for granting certain duties to the in the American colonies and plantations for continuing amending and making perpetual, an act passed in the 6th year of the reign of His late Majesty King George II. And this act, of course, would be the Sugar Act. Taxing the colonies. The Stamp Act of 1765. Colonists had to pay for an official stamp or seal on purchase of paper items. There were immediate protests over this. The Sons of Liberty, a group who formed to resist these tax acts, sometimes used violence. This violence would be directed against against tax collectors. The Stamp Act Congress of 1765 declared the tax to be a violation of colonial rights and encouraged people to boycott the purchase of paper items. The boycott was so successful that Parliament repealed the tax in 1766. If you purchased anything made of paper, it had to have this half-cent tax stamp on it. This is an example of the actual stamp. A protest stamp, something that you would have seen being given around as well as part of the protest, is this here, a cartoon that says an emblem of the effects of the stamp. And at the bottom it says, "Oh, the fatal stamp." For them, they liken paying this tax as being like death, essentially. The protest became so violent in Boston, Massachusetts, that the people rioted and attacked the house of the governor of the Massachusetts colony and threw his furniture out into the street and set it on fire. And then, of course, there were the attacks on the tax collectors themselves. People of Boston here being depicted tarring and feathering a tax collector and forcing him to drink hot tea. This cartoon was originally drawn by Benjamin Franklin in 1754. And this was part of his effort at a meeting that was held in Albany, New York, at the beginning of the French and Indian War. Franklin urged the members of the Albany Congress to adopt a plan that he had that was called the Albany Plan for Union. It was an early attempt that was started by Benjamin Franklin to unite all 13 colonies under a common colonial government. In 1754, his idea was rejected because they all the leaders of the colonies felt that they owed their allegiance to the king. This cartoon is one that he drew to illustrate the predicament that they found themselves in at the beginning of the French and Indian War. All of the colonies are separate from each other, and the colonial body here is depicted as a snake, which actually resembles the real shape of the colonies at the time. The colonies were just a long, thin, narrow strip of land that hugged the Atlantic coast of North America, and so Franklin chose to depict it as a snake. The head of the snake here is labeled NE for the New England colonies, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and so forth. Then you have this part of the snake's body labeled with NY for New York, NJ for New Jersey, P for Pennsylvania, M for Maryland, V for Virginia, NC for North Carolina, SC for South Carolina, and then finally G for Georgia. And the caption at the bottom, unite or die. Either we all come together and we live as one, or we remain separate and we die alone. This cartoon he drew as a way to try to illustrate the situation that they were in and try to urge them to come together. In 1754, this idea was rejected. But in the 1760s, this idea comes up again, and it becomes more commonly accepted that at some point the colonies are going to have to come together, that they are going to have to unite or face death. Taxing the colonies. The Townshend Acts of 1767. The Townshend Acts included taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. Basically anything that would be imported into the colonies would have a tax placed upon it. Unlike what had happened before, a new law was passed that went with the Townshend Acts, and this law was called the Writs of Assistance. The Writs of Assistance gave permission to tax collectors and royal government officials to get the assistance of the British Army in North America to help them collect taxes and enforce the law. This is probably the single worst idea that anybody in British government could have come up with. Using the military to act as law enforcement is never a good idea. The military's primary purpose in life is to break things and kill people, frankly. And when you take the military and make it act as law enforcement, you're sending exactly the kind of wrong message to a population of people who are already fiercely independent. Instead of scaring them or terrorizing them into obedience, what's going to happen is you're going to enrage them, infuriate them, and make them want to resist. And that's what does happen. The colonists boycotted British goods with an agreement that went across all the colonies called the Non-Importation Agreement. They just refused to buy anything that was made in Great Britain. The Sons of Liberty attacked customs houses. They would set fire to these buildings where goods were stored while they were waiting tax stamps to be placed on them. Goods would be destroyed. 4,000 British troops were sent to Boston in 1768 in order to restore order. The population of the entire city of Boston at the time was right around 15,000 people. And so what you have is a situation where you have an overwhelming number of British troops that are placed in a town with a population of around 15,000. And this is how you send that wrong message. People are going to see this as what it's intended to be. It's intended to be a threat. You're threatening to use force against people who frankly are just dissatisfied with the way the government is being run. And this is exactly the wrong way to handle the situation. The British really messed this up. The Townshend Acts would eventually be repealed in 1770 because the resistance against them was so successful, but the British Parliament would maintain the tax on tea to exert its authority over the colonies, and this is what is going to cause the biggest problem. Now, the Townshend Acts of 1767 were proposed by Charles Townshend, a member of Parliament. The law would be known as the Townshend Act, named after him because of that. And of course, it imposed taxes and duties on pretty much anything that could be imported, as previously mentioned: glass, paint, paper, textiles, tea, anything the colonists imported from Great Britain. These taxes would be used to help pay for the king's troops stationed in the colonies. It would help pay off the British debt from the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. To the colonists, it was just an example, yet again, of taxation without representation. And this slogan referred to taxes passed by Parliament that the colonists themselves had not voted on. In protest, the colonists joined together. They boycotted British-made goods, and the boycott was effective. It worked to the point that, again, in 1770, Parliament repealed all of the Townshend duties except for the one on tea. And that tax on tea would be at the center of what would be the biggest display of resistance to British authority yet, and that would be the Boston Tea Party. Focus question number 1. Explain how British efforts to raise taxes on the colonists sparked protest. Main idea 2. The Boston Massacre caused colonial resentment toward Great Britain. On March 5th, 1770, a crowd gathered in Boston after a British soldier struck a colonist who had been yelling and shouting at him. The colonist was a wig maker's apprentice. His name is escaping me right now. He was young, though. He was only 17 years old, and he was angry. He was angry because, like many people in Boston, because of the way that the British were enforcing the law, he and many other men were unemployed, and he was outraged by it. And the British soldiers in Boston were the embodiment of what the people in Boston thought of as British. I don't know how I would describe that. The British mistreatment of the colonists. And so this young man put his hands upon British soldier. He shoved him, was yelling at him. The soldier struck the young man with the butt of his musket and, kind of split his head open, caused him to bleed. The young man takes off, tells others what was done to him, and a crowd begins to gather. And by midnight on March the 5th, you have a large mob of angry, unemployed men wandering the streets of Boston, outraged at the British and wanting to take their rage out on someone. And what ends up happening is a soldier who is guarding the customs house on King Street is surrounded by an enormous mob of people. The changing of the guard takes place in the middle of the night, and the officer that's in charge of the changing of the guard, a British lieutenant by the name of Preston, sees the commotion on King Street and rushes the few soldiers that he has with him. These guys are just going to be on guard duty in various places, so he's changing out the guard, and he leads 7 or 8 men to the point where one British soldier is being overwhelmed by this mob. And the mob has the guy surrounded. They're throwing things at him. And when these other soldiers come up, things get worse. In the beginning, they're throwing snowballs. Then they start throwing chunks of ice. And then people start throwing anything they can get their hands on. Rocks, clubs. They start pulling cobblestones up out of the street and throwing them. At some point, one of the British soldiers is struck in the head. and knocked down. And whether he discharged his weapon on accident or if he purposely did it, I'm not entirely sure of. But what ended up happening was the British soldiers were in a state of panic. They fired into the crowd, and one of the first to be killed was a former slave by the name of Crispus Attucks. 3 men were killed immediately, Crispus Attucks being one of them. 2 others would die later of their wounds. The shootings would be labeled the Boston Massacre by the Sons of Liberty, who seized upon this as a propaganda opportunity. Now, I can tell you, having been in a similar situation to what these men faced, being surrounded by an angry mob of people, even though I think that what these British soldiers did was more a case of complete lack of discipline and complete control of their weaponry, I know for a fact that they would have been terrified, as any of us would be. And what they did was they defended themselves. This was a self-defense issue. But the propaganda side of this took hold. It was labeled the Boston Massacre by the Sons of Liberty, and it ended up causing more resentment against the British, not the least because of this cartoon, which purportedly was created by Paul Revere. But Paul Revere actually plagiarized this because somebody else drew a similar scene earlier, and Paul Revere simply stole it. The way that this cartoon is drawn, if you look at it, it looks like what happened occurred in the daytime. Lieutenant Preston, the commander of the change of the guard, can be seen here, and he's got his sword up in the air and pointing forward as though he were ordering the men to fire. But that's not what happened. Preston wasn't behind the men ordering them to fire. He was in front of them trying to keep them from doing that. He was ordering them not to open fire on the crowd. The appearance of this, it looks like it's happening in the day. The only thing that indicates it was actually the middle of the night, if you look up here in the upper left-hand corner, is the moon. But other than that, it looks like the daytime, and it looks like the crowd itself is not unruly. They're not throwing anything. They're just innocent people. And to prove that they are innocent, there are 2 things inserted in this drawing here that most people don't really pay attention to. One of them would be this innocent-looking woman right here. She's very peaceful, and she's not doing anybody any harm. And then there's this little dog right there. It makes the scene look very peaceful, and these British soldiers fired into the crowd for no reason. This is a piece of pure propaganda. The scene was violent. It was not as depicted in this engraving, but as the old saying goes, perception is reality. And if you see something that somebody tells you is the truth, even if it's a lie, you're likely to believe it. We see this on the internet all the time today. People can be easily fooled into believing things that are not true. And what was said of the soldiers that were involved in the so-called Boston Massacre, not only was it not true, but one of the members of the Sons of Liberty, John Adams, who would go on to be 2nd President of the United States, he actually defended these British soldiers in court. And they were acquitted of the main crime that they were accused of, which was murder. Instead, it was found that they were defending themselves against a mob that was intent on harming or even killing them. Focus question number 2. How did the Boston Massacre cause colonial resentment towards Great Britain? Main idea 3. Colonists protested the British tax on tea with the Boston Tea Party. Colonial merchants smuggled tea to avoid paying the British tea tax. The smuggled tea, oddly enough, actually cost more than the taxed tea did. And this was one of the main reasons for the resentment against the tea tax, because the tea was being shipped directly to the colonies from India without having a tax affixed to it at a British port. They just shipped it directly to America, and the reasoning behind that was, let's lower the price of tea. We'll put a little tax on it, but it will still cost less than it did before, and this will make the colonists happy. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773 to allow the British East India Company to sell cheap tea to the colonists. that was supposed to make them happy, but it didn't. Colonial merchants and smugglers were opposed to this idea because it cut into their profits, and so they protested it and used as the excuse that this is just another tax and this is them trying to assert their authority over us, and we don't recognize it. Now buy our more expensive tea so that we can make money. That's basically how that went. On December 16, 1773, colonists, most of them members of the Sons of Liberty, and smugglers themselves, disguised themselves as Indians, and they attacked British tea ships that were at anchor in Boston Harbor. The ships had been unable to unload their tea because the dock workers refused to do so, and the captains of the ships had no orders on what to do if they couldn't unload it, so they just sat there. And these guys dressed as Indians rowed out in boats to the tea ships, and they destroyed all of it. They tossed it all overboard to the tune of, I think, what would be about $6 million in value. And this incident would be called the Boston Tea Party. And here you can see a depiction. Of course, this was drawn much, much later. You have tea ships at anchor. You have members of the Sons of Liberty dressed up as Native Americans, and they're tossing chests of tea into the water, being cheered on by people on the dockside. And it's kind of a party atmosphere. But what ends up happening as a result of this, it ends up being a pretty not good thing. Focus question number 3. Why did colonists protest the British tax on tea with the Boston Tea Party? Main idea 4. Great Britain responded to colonial actions by passing what were called by the colonists the Intolerable Acts. The first of these acts closed Boston Harbor. And this meant that these men who had been unemployed a few years earlier, which led, of course, to the Boston Massacre, now they're all unemployed again. They have no jobs because the harbor is closed. They have no work. The second act, the Massachusetts Charter, was canceled. The Massachusetts government was suspended, and Massachusetts was placed under military law with a regular British Army general in command, basically, acting as the governor. The third act, royal officials accused of crimes would be sent to Great Britain for trial. In the Boston Massacre, the British allowed their own soldiers to be put on trial in Boston, I think fully expecting that they would be found guilty and put to death. This would be something that they were willing to accept if it would keep the peace. Now, after the Boston Tea Party, if you're a British officer and you're accused of a crime in the colonies, you'll be shipped all the way back to Great Britain for trial, which means the likelihood of a trial ever happening is basically non-existent. The fourth act, General Sir Thomas Gage was made the new governor of Massachusetts. Focus question number 4. What were the Intolerable Acts, and how did they cause even greater resentment directed against Great Britain? The essential question. Describe how tensions developed as the British government placed tax after tax on the colonies. How did the colonists react, and what was the British government's response to these actions?